It's so great to get a chance to talk to you. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed reading Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age. I have to ask you a first quick question. Was the original publication date of this book set for July of 2020? Was it supposed to be published later? Did you rush it out, given that we're all living through the most dramatic transitions collectively of our entire lives?
So it's the opposite, which is to say the book was scheduled to come out in May of 2020. And when the pandemic first hit, we sort of pulled it for a moment and sat still, frozen for a month. As you say, this book is about what I call life quakes, which are these moments of kind of massive change when life appears to be coming at you from all directions. And it was kind of lost on none of us that we were in a life quake. We didn't know how long. We held it, and then we sort of then had this big debate. Should we do it in the summer? Should we do it in the fall, into the election? Should we wait till next year? Sort of there's this whole idea in book publishing about, new year, new you. And basically, finally, my editor raised his hand and he said, you know what? People need this now, and we're going to publish it the minute that we can. And that turned out to be July. And as you said, it landed in this moment when everybody kind of had this visceral need. I mean, I feel like, as a kind of prelude to the conversation we're about to have, that I wandered around. I'm at my home in Brooklyn tonight. I feel like I wandered around here for years saying, we're all in transitions. We should be talking more about transitions. Why is no one talking about transitions? Why has there not been a big book about transitions in 40 years? And then boom, lo and behold, the book arrives at this moment where I no longer have to persuade people that they're in a transition. They just know that they are, and they're like, tell me what to do, please.
You talk to so many, in many cases, extraordinary people who went through voluntary, involuntary transitions. And we'll talk about some of them. But I have to tell you, look, you became famous. I mean, you had an international bestseller with certainly Walking the Bible. I think I'm right to say that was the book that really exploded your career. And as many people in this audience know you, they know your family, they know your brother Andrew, who I think is watching tonight. And if he is, hi Andrew, it's good he's by such a great supporter of yours, Bruce. I never fail to get a note from Andrew saying, Bruce has a new book coming out. You need to talk to him. But here's my point. So Walking the Bible, you go literally on a 10,000-mile journey that most of us have read or watched the PBS series that you narrated about it. But there's this interesting thing here, Bruce, to me. Tell me if you think I'm making a point or not. In some ways, this book, Life is in the Transitions, has been a book that is a culmination of a journey that I'm going to say began when you're 5 years old. You know why I'm picking 5 years old?
Because that's when I broke my leg.
That's exactly right. 5 years old, for people who don't know this story, you're in Savannah. Your family lives in a subdivision where all the streets are named for Confederate officers. You lived in what? Robert E. Lee Highway? Robert
E. Lee Boulevard. I keep assuming I keep assuming that the Times are going to catch up with this neighborhood and they're going to change the names, but
I would hope so. Let's hope they do. But okay, you're riding your bicycle and you get into a horrific accident. A car hits you, knocks you out, breaks your femur, and you're in a full body cast for months, right? So, okay, so that happened when you're 5. But we move ahead 3 decades when you got your diagnosis of bone cancer, and the cancer was in that bone, that femur. And I think it was the cancer led to your book, Council of Dads, which people are familiar with because they know the NBC series, in which you talked about, if you're not there, who are the 6 best friends who can mentor your daughter. And I think in a way that began you on this journey to transition. That was because that transition, the cancer transition, started you thinking about transitions in a way you never had before. I think it's safe to say. Yes?
Well, first of all, you devilish genius, you've got me crying here. We're 3 minutes into this conversation. That's a beautiful story. That's a correct story. Let me frame the story this way. There was this moment on this journey that became Life is in the Transitions, where I pulled a book off of a shelf one day and the whole shelf opened up, that kind of like, and there was another room, like that trapdoor fantasy. Like it turns out that Dan Brown has one of these in his castle in France. And what I discovered in that other room is this idea that has consumed me, that was new for me at the time. And it's one of the things that is resonating about this book out in the world now. And that is this idea that our lives kind of have a shape to them, and that shape is determined sort of by how we look at the world. So you mentioned walking the Bible and the many years I spent in the ancient world. So in the ancient world, they don't have linear time. So they think that life is a cycle because that's what the seasons are. To every season, turn, turn, turn. The Bible actually introduces the idea of linear time. And so if you go in the Middle Ages, they think that life is a kind of staircase up to middle age. You peak at middle age and then it's downhill from there. And that's a big idea because it's opposite of how we were raised, where middle age is sort of the bottom. Okay. And so let's just fast forward to 100 plus years ago in the birth of science, then suddenly they're starting to say that life follows a linear arrow of progress. Okay. So many ideas that we grew up with, those of us who were born in the 20th century, Piaget, children have development, Freud, sexual development, Erikson, the 8 stages of moral development, the 5 stages of grief, the hero's journey. All of these ideas are linear constructs of life. And this reaches its peak in the 70s, where Gail Sheehy writes this book, Passages, that says everyone does the same thing in their 20s, everyone does the same thing in their 30s, and then everyone has this midlife crisis at 39 and a half, and that introduces and popularizes the notion of the midlife crisis. And this sort of that book sells 20 million copies, and this just becomes a fact. So that's how they looked at the world. It turns out that's total bunk. And that now we know the world is much more complex and has twists and turns, but we haven't changed the way we live our lives. So I bring up that sort of piece of the idea because this is what happened to me. So yes, I'm born in Savannah, Georgia, 5 generations of Jews in the South. I break my leg when I'm 5. I get hit by a car. I'm in this body cast for 2 months. And then that's the only medically interesting thing that happens to me for decades. I go on, I live my life. I leave the South. I go Northeast to college. I go to Japan. I start writing letters home. When I get back to Georgia, everyone says, I loved your letters. I was like, that's great. Have we met? And I'm like, I should write a book about this. It's interesting to me and all these people. I write this book, Learning to Bow. It doesn't happen this way. I saw my first book at 24, and this is what I do for the next 2 decades. As you said, I joined the circus, or as Leslie said, I joined the circus. And then I spent a year in Nashville writing about country music. I have this idea to retrace the Bible. I go back and forth in my 30s and write these books. They become bestsellers, and I'm on TV. I get married and I have children. You know what that is, Bill? That's the linear life. Like that's the fantasy that we all have. Yeah. Until in my 40s, I just get walloped by life. Like boom, boom, boom. First is the cancer. I'm 43, a new dad. Suddenly I've got a cancer that only 100 Americans a year get. I'm on crutches for 2 years. That's the first nonlinear event in my life. Suddenly the linear life is gone. That happens to be when the Great Recession is. So suddenly, my family is struggling. I almost go bankrupt. And then my dad in Georgia, who's struggling with Parkinson's, gets very depressed. He's never depressed a minute in his life. He tries to take his life 6 times in 12 weeks. No. And so suddenly I'm in this situation where life is coming at me in all directions, and I'm looking around like, how do I get through this? And that's when I realized, like, there wasn't a book out there for when you are in one of these moments. And that's the beginning of this idea. Like, I need to go out and find out. I'm not alone in this situation. What do you do when you're in one of these life quakes?
So I want to pick up on that. I do want to go back to counsel of dads, just to the extent of saying that was you point out in the book, you say, when all this is going on, when your dad is trying to kill himself, your cancer, the family business, you say, I lost control of the story bouncing around in my head. For a while, I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I was going. I was lost. What happens when we misplace the plot of our lives? And I think to some extent, coming up with this notion just of doing the Council of Dads, assuring your daughters will have male mentors, male role models to move forward with, was one of your ways of addressing and trying to gain back some control over your life, which is why I say in some ways it's the predecessor to this book that we're now talking about tonight. Fair enough?
No, it's interesting. We're talking a lot about my parents here, who sort of helped me and become a creative person and support this crazy life that I wanted to live. I actually want to invoke my in-laws here for a second, because they really pushed me in this direction that you're pushing me in, which is, I think that for a long time I saw first the cancer, and then especially this experience in life is in the transitions. I think I saw them as a rupture with the past, as something different from, say, growing up in Georgia, from walking the Bible and these books about ancient religion. But I think that you're making a subtle point that took me a long time to realize, which is that there's this connection between them. First of all, I think there's a connection to having grown up in Georgia, and particularly as a Jew in Georgia, where these two storytelling traditions sort of collided in me.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's something about having spent more than a decade of my life going back and forth to the Middle East, immersed in the greatest stories ever told, is that I thought a lot about narrative and about the role of narrative in shaping identity and in shaping culture. And as powerful as that connection is, there's a big difference. And so if I could just take a second and invite everybody listening to us to try to hear that story that's going on in the back of your head. It's the story of where you came from, the story of who you are, where you came from, where you're going, what's important to you. If you got a call right now that a loved one was in the hospital and you had to rush to the hospital, that story you're telling about your relationship with that loved one, like that is the story of who we are. And the big difference, Bill, between today and when I first started being interested in storytelling and in the ancient world, where the idea that storytelling could build culture was born, is that we now know, because we can peer inside the human brain, we now know that we are wired for story. And we know that that's how we process the world. And we know that that story you tell yourself is not part of you in a fundamental way. It is you in an actual way. Like life is the story that you tell yourself. So I think that the connection between the Georgia part of me, the writing letters from Japan part of me, the writing 5 books about the Bible part of me, is realizing that that act of storytelling is fundamentally what happens to us when we hit a crisis. So when we hit a wall, when we get into a problem, when our life swerves off the road, that is a breach in the normal. And the only way to heal a breach in the normal of your life is with storytelling. Like that's what you tell a story about. You got up this morning, you went off into your day, you came back, maybe you didn't go too far because we're all in quarantine right now. And then you had a loved one or a friend and you told that story. You didn't tell the boring parts. You told the parts when things went wrong. That's the act of storytelling that we're all in right now, because the pandemic has forced us into one of these breaches.
So if I can go into a middle section of your book, Life in the Transitions, you tell us a story about the great poet Dante Alighieri. You say that in 1302, he was exiled from his hometown of Florence in a political feud, which was the moment when his story that he'd been telling himself was disrupted. And he would tell us he wandered for years around Tuscany. You describe him as being heartsick and bereft before finally accepting he would never return home. So having been put in that situation, he's got a choice, as all of the characters in your book do. They come to a moment where the narrative has been disrupted by some crisis. In some cases, it's a crisis that was foisted upon them, and others they make choices that nevertheless call for them to rethink their life stories. Okay, so what does Dante do once he accepts this, you tell us? He writes the Divine Comedy, one of the greatest works of Western literature. And the beginning of it, you put the first stanza in. Midway in our life's journey, I went astray from the straight road and woke to find myself alone in a dark wood, describing that moment when he lost, as you did, he lost touch with the narrative and had to find a way back. Yeah?
My single favorite phrase gets to this moment that I uncovered with this book. What happened with this book was two things, okay? So I actually did two things in this moment when I decided to go on this journey. One is I seek out what becomes hundreds of people, all ages, all walks of life, all 50 states, who had been through similar life quakes as I was going through. But then I also start combing through kind of the history of Western ideas. And you mentioned Dante, you could have easily mentioned Augustine, you could have mentioned F. Scott Fitzgerald when he has a nervous breakdown and goes into the mountains of North Carolina. You could have mentioned, everybody has one of these stories. But my favorite phrase of this, as you know, because it kind of is laced all through Life is in the Transitions, is this, what turned out to be an Italian phrase originally from Latin, which is lupus in fabula. And lupus is wolf.
Wolf.
So fabula is the fairy tale. Like, that's our lives when everything is going well. Like, that's the fantasy of our lives. Lupus is the wolf, okay? And the Italians use this expression to mean, you know, speak of the devil. Like, just when everything's going well, boom, lupus and fabula, the wolf shows up. And that gets to the point, right? So, you know, a lot of this notion about storytelling gets locked in when we're really young, okay? When superhero stories are so important to us and fairy tales are so important to us. And we want to think of our lives as a fairy tale, and we think we're the hero and we're going to have the happy ending. But guess what? That's not what makes it a fairy tale. What makes it a fairy tale is that the wolf shows up. It could be an ogre, it could be a dragon, it could be a troll, it could be a tornado, it could be a downsizing, it could be a death, it could be a pandemic. And our instinct is to want to strangle the wolf and say, how dare you ruin the story, but the wolf is making the story. Because you have to figure out how to get over, around, or under the wolf. I remember when I was reading, you and I were talking off air about my children. So I'm the dad of identical twin daughters. And I read to them when they were very young. Then they became readers and they kicked me out of the room. But then I got about 4 or 5 years in there where I could read to them again at night before now they've kicked me out of the room because they wanted to do their own reading. And one of the books I read to them was A Wrinkle in Time, and I had never read it.
Yeah.
And so you've got Meg, right? The father is dispatched off, right? This is not long after I almost died. And she has got to go planetarily hopping to find the dad. And we get to the dad part of the story, and I shut the book. I've never read the book. And I say, what's going to happen? Who's going to save the day? And what do my 10-year-old daughters say? Dad. Right? They wouldn't say it now at 15, but at 10 they say, Dad. I'm like, I don't even know what's going to happen. I'm like, nope, the dad is not going to save the day. The hero has to save the day. Who's the hero? Wow. Meg is the hero. And that's the point of when the wolf shows up. And that's the point for Dante. When you get lost in the woods, that's when it becomes a story. And if there's one thing I learned, and if everybody listening to us takes one thing from this conversation, is you have to be the hero of your own story.
I love that. Okay, so I want to tie in another one of your books to this conversation, which I think is perfect. The First Love Story, Adam and Eve. One of the things that's extraordinary about that book, I love, you know how much I love that book, because you completely redefine our understanding of Adam and Eve. And you do it using what you say is the more authentic reading of that story in Genesis. But here's the point. You tell us that Adam and Eve, look, they face the biggest wolf imaginable. They're thrown out of the Garden of Eden, for God's sake. Satan appears before them, and then God exiles them. But you point out that that's not the end of the story. That's just the beginning of the story in that book, which is why that book is so wonderful. Because they go on and essentially have a happy marriage. Yeah, Cain and Abel are a mess. But you say they go on and they find a way, they love each other, and their love is a model for all of us. And I love that because that's what you talk about here. I mean, what bigger wolf is there than what they face? And there's a couple in your book Jamie and Rebecca Levine are a couple who went through a transition together, right?
First of all, that's a beautiful question. And gosh, I just love being with you. And I hope everyone listening to you knows what a treasure you are, Bill. So I'm just so thrilled to be here. And yes, Adam and Eve, being kicked out of Eden, could have split and ended humanity right there. What do? They come back together and they have 2 children. That's great. They've solved the problem. One of those children murders the other one. Now what's going to happen? They could split again and they come back together and they have Seth, because it's the Seth who becomes the link to all the others in the story. There's an example of a life quake, and a transition bringing them back together. And this is what I encountered over and over again. Jamie Levine, it's one of my wife's favorite stories in this book, I have to say. So Jamie grows up actually in Worcester, Massachusetts, and his father works at a shoe factory, because that's like one of the shoe capitals of New England, and he's laid off. And so Jamie gets this like chip on his shoulder. He's going to be like the savior and make the money that the dad never made. And he's hard driving, and he's the head of this plays on this sports team, and he's the head of this, elite extracurricular. He's going to breeze into Harvard. He's turned down. So he doesn't get to go to Harvard. He goes to another college, but then he drives and gets himself into Wharton, the top business school. From there, he gets a job at Goldman Sachs. Like, that's the job everybody wants. He rises, he's on his way to partner. He moves to London. He marries a woman who's a management consultant. And like, they are like Barbie and Ken of like that highly educated set. They have a child. Everything is going well, except that her organs are not working. Yeah. And she starts to crash. And her bilirubin number, which is her kidney number, if I have the right organ, begins to crash. And he's like working at the job during the day, sitting at the hospital at night, and they're basically waiting for the day that she's going to die, because there's no drug that can do it, until like the neighbor's brother, son, sister's boyfriend reads an article in the Boston Globe that there's one doctor in Boston who's got a cocktail that can make her live. 3 days later, he's on the plane. A week later, the daughter is there. A month later, they move to Boston, and they've reoriented their lives every day. Like her number slowly begins to rise. It saves her life, but every single night for the rest of her life, she's got to be on this device that processes her body. And he's trying to like make partner, and he's trying to be with her at night and trying to be Superman, and he hits a wall. And as he said to me, I got fired. Yeah. He's climbed to the top. He's at the job he's always wanted, and he gets fired. This, as you know, in the words of my book, is an involuntary life quake. And it absolutely saves the family. It saves the family because he realizes he's got to do this census, because what happens in a life quake, what's happening to everybody listening to this conversation right now, is that it is a meaning vacuum when the normal building blocks of what gives you identity is just sucked out of the room. And you have to ask what everybody listening to us is asking. Like, what's important to me? Do I want to work? Do I want to spend more time with my family? Do I want to move? All the questions you ask in a life transition. And he ultimately downsizes, takes a different job, becomes a different manager. They have another kid. Like the wife joins the school. She's having, sort of struggles adapting to all of this. And he rebalances what people do in a life quake. They shape shift in the language that I sort of came up with. They rebalance what's important to them and reset their lives, basically just in time.
And this goes back to what you talked about a little earlier, which is this notion of what is the shape of our lives. And the Gail Sheehy model, which you described, basically is up, we're 25, we're 30, we're 40, 45, whoops, everything is downhill from there. It's a very much an inverted V, right? Is that a fair way to describe that shape?
Yes, I think that she might say it might go up at the end, but it's definitely very linear. And it's uniform. Everybody goes through the same shape is, in fact, in some ways the most important part of that story that's so misleading.
Yeah, fair enough. But, you talk about various notions of time and, this notion of time being circular in the book rather than linear. And one of the things that I think is so interesting that you asked people is how would they describe the shape of their lives, understanding that transitions, when they face a life quake, something is going to reshape their direction, whether again voluntary or involuntary. And so it gives them a chance to rethink, what should they have as the shape of their life? All right, that said, Bruce, you went through a life quake with cancer and with all the other things happening in your family. Because of the pandemic, and we'll talk more about the pandemic, I hope, in a little while, but just for now, has this created even a different shape, the pandemic, than the one you saw for yourself when you were confronted with cancer? In other words, is it a constantly evolving thing in your life personally? Does that make sense, that question?
Yes, I think, let me take a step back. So I'm off doing these conversations. And even before I started the conversations, I start to realize, because back to me stumbling into that room in the library that no one told me was there, I start asking people, like everywhere I go, like, what shape is your life?
Yeah.
Just to see what people would say.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say what I would have said. If you had asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have said that the shape of my life was like a line, kind of like your time. It had some ups, it had some downs, but it was basically a line. So I'm talking, actually, I'll credit him. I'll do the behind the scenes here. I'm talking to my friend Michael, actually. And I say to him one day, Michael's had a kind of a complicated life. He grows up, he's sort of estranged from his family, he moves to New York. He's in the beauty business and in the art business, and he's gay, and he's had a gay marriage that has failed, and now he's dating again. And so I say to him, what shape is your life? And he says, a heart. And I'm like, no. You don't understand. I'm asking you, what shape is your life? Like, what's the trajectory of your life? He says, a heart. And I'm like, no, you're maybe I'm not asking my question, like you keep saying to me. Maybe I'm asking my question wrong. And he's like, no, maybe you're not hearing what I'm saying. My life, Bruce, is a heart. I don't care so much about the ups and downs of my life. The most important thing to my life is my relationships. And if they're going well, then I don't really care how I'm doing professionally or personally. And it was like one of those moments, Bill, was like, whoa, like, I am missing something relatively fundamental about how people think about their lives. So I kept doing this and I kept doing this. And then I continue into these conversations, right? So I've had all these people all over the planet. I mean, like, I'm all over the country who've had all these life experiences. And then the last question I ask them is, what shape is your life? And the answers are all over the place originally. Like, some people say a line, some people say a stock market, some people say a winding river, some people say a heart, some people say a house, right? Some people say a daffodil, or some people say a piece of lettuce. Or
what's yours? What's your shape?
So I'm a line. I'm like a conventional person in this thing, and I'm like a really boring person.
You're an adventurer. You're a guy who goes out and seeks adventure and new opportunity. You're saying that you're a line is diminishing the importance of a line.
Well, okay. So what happens is, for a second, we go back to my story, and I'll come back to me in a second. So for a long time, this feels like a party game in college at 3 a.m. and this is going nowhere. But I have this like team of people, and we're analyzing this, and I'm like, we got to find it. We got to find it. So we go back over, and then one day, like the coin falls in the slots and the sevens come up. And what I realize is that these shapes fall into buckets. So there's people who give lines, winding river, a road, a stock market. There are people who give these geometric shapes, the house, the heart, and there are people who give objects.
Yeah.
And then in sort of this long process, which I will leave off stage, I came to realize we have what I call the ABCs of meaning, okay? These are the building blocks of what give us identity.
Mm-hmm.
You go back a century ago, most people had to live what their parents wanted them to live, do what their parents wanted them to do, believe what their parents wanted them to believe, love who their parents wanted them to love. The good news is we now can change all of that. The bad news is it's very hard and we struggle. So the way we do it are these 3 building blocks of meaning. The A is agency. That's what we do, create, make. I think the reason I'm aligned is because I'm a creator and I'm a maker, and therefore I like to do things and go on trips and follow journeys and write
Fair
books.
enough. I get it.
So that's the A. So I'm agency driven. B is belonging, right? That's our relationships, our family, our friend, our co-religionists, our colleagues, our whatever, our community, our political movement, whatever it might be. And the C is a cause. That's something higher than ourselves that we give back. Okay? So what happens is it turns out that the people who give a line tend to be agency first. The people who tend to give a heart or a house or belonging first, and the people who give a cause are who give an object or cause first. Like my wife works, so everybody ranks them. We all have all 3 of them in us. So I would be an ABC because I'm very agency oriented. I'm an incredibly involved dad, and cause is not the biggest thing in my life. Okay, my wife, she works with entrepreneurs. She started an organization. She helps them in 50 countries and cities around the world. They have an outlet endeavor in Atlanta. She's cause-oriented. Like she's CA, cause, agency, belonging. Like she tolerates the rest of us, but she's really motivated by giving back. So by the way, what are you? So I'm an ABC. She's a CAB. What are you, before I go any further?
I was trying to figure that out, because one of the things I think is, and I'm not going to duck it, but one of the things that's so interesting about envisioning your life, the shape of your life, is it opens up doors for opportunity. The way you see what the path that you've carved out for yourself. I'm glad you explained what it means to be aligned more specifically, because I would have said, I was trying to figure out, I am footprints in a forest,
wow.
Going off into various paths and getting lost looking at various things, because I love to find new things to really focus. I get very caught up in, right now, my daughter is home, my 24-year-old from Brooklyn. She's really into K-pop. So I've really gone on this journey learning about all the K-pop groups with her, and it's really fun to do that. I am into horses, and so when I really go off on a horse riding binge, I learn everything. I read every book on her. So I sort of see me as these footprints out in the woods having fun going in various places. Does that make any sense at all?
I was going to make a dynamite joke because of K-pop. My knowledge of K-pop is probably less deep than yours, but I've got 15-year-old daughters who are into K-beauty, because that's where the cutting edge of the beauty industry is in.
Okay, so enough. Here's what I want to do, though. I think one of the most interesting shapes in your book is Tammy. Is it Trottier? Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
From the Turtle Mountain Indian Reservation. Tell us about Tammy and what her shape is.
So here's the thing to understand about shape, and I'll tell Tammy's story for a second. The thing to understand about shape is that, like everything else in life, it's nonlinear and it changes. So that's the sort of the premise that I want to begin with, because that's what happens in a time of change. I mean, even the story that you just told, okay, your daughter's off in Brooklyn living her life, okay, these passions that you pursue. To me, I listen to your story and I hear footprints, like that's a cause thing. Like footprints are something that, that you're making an impression, and your life devoted to the arts and devoted to storytelling and devoted to journalism and devoted to bringing people in new places. That's a cause part of you. The agency part of you is the person who goes digging and goes on the journey. And that's what you would have been doing one set of journeys in 2020, but then your daughter comes home and suddenly, boom, your B elevates and you're going to go on this journey with her. And that's what happens. We shape shift in times of transition in our lives. You asked me earlier about me. Right now, when I watch the news about what's happening with the virus and the pandemic and the quarantine, I've got teenagers. Like, I'm actually not watching it through the prism of how it affects me. Like, if I had to stay inside for, the next 6 months, that would be disappointing, but I could do it. I'm looking at it entirely through the prism of my daughters. Like, they need to be out there in the world. And so I'm willing to downplay my agency in the service of my belonging right now. And that's what we're all doing. Tammy Trottier is a good example. So Tammy is born in this Indian reservation on the Canadian border of North Dakota. And she's the youngest of about, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, as I recall. And her parents run basically the convenience store in town. And she doesn't talk for the first large chunk of her life. And her siblings want nothing to do, like, oh, go take your sister with you to the market. And I'm like, really? Do we have to? And the parents sit the children down and say, who wants to take over basically the family general store? And 3 hands goes up, and she's like, no, I want out of here. So she goes to the big city, gets a degree, goes on to the bigger city and gets a PhD in clinical psychology, and she's left it behind. She has entered kind of the Western medicine. She's left her native name behind, and she's going by her Western name, and she has turned her back and like, I'm fleeing the family and I'm heading toward, the larger world, until she hits a wall. She gets married. She wants to have a child. It's challenging to her. She finds that she's not so welcome in her workplace because she's an Indigenous person, and they are not able to see this Indigenous person, especially a woman, as somebody skilled who can enter this hard driving kind of academic world that she's trying to enter into. And what does she do? This is a crisis. She shape shifts, and she goes back to her sense of belonging, and she goes back. She reclaims her Indigenous name. She starts studying, traditional non-Western medicine. She goes into the animal iconography of her tribe, and she stumbles onto this turtle. And this turtle is the symbol of healing. Now, of course, this is meaningful to me because in Walking the Bible, when I was on crutches in Council of Dads, when I was on crutches for 2 years, a turtle becomes incredibly symbolic to me because I learned that 200 years ago in France, these flaneurs, these walkers, used to take turtles for a walk and let the turtle set the pace. And I'm like, so my personal slogan in life is take a walk with a turtle and behold the world in pause. She finds the turtle in native medicine. I interviewed her in the room I'm sitting in right now. She actually flew from North Dakota for this conversation. And I was like, oh my gosh, like we're, whatever, Jungian siblings here. She goes back to the reservation. She's the first with 2 friends, the first Native American all-woman mental health facility in the tribal lands in North Dakota. And she's merging her Western medicine knowledge with her, Native, Indigenous, traditional medicine past to try to reach people who need this help. And what is that? Well, that's a shapeshift.
Yeah, I love that story. I mean, there's so many stories in here that I love, but so let's be clear about something. You make the point that virtually none of us escape life quakes, that there are very few people anywhere who get through without the narrative that we've put in our heads and imagine is going to shape our lives for until we die, that it's not upended in some way. Again, in some cases voluntary, in many cases involuntary. But we all go through them, right?
So let me say this, Bill. I did not set out on this journey looking for life quakes, looking for life transitions. I set out on a simple question. No one knows how to tell their story anymore. What can I do to help? And the way I'm going to help is I'm going to ask people, tell me the story of your life. That was the first question. I asked 225 people, and that led to this 2 hour. I basically said, tell me the story of your life in 15 minutes. Nobody took less than an hour. Now I did interrupt them, but and I just listened very intently. And here's what I learned. And at the end of it, I had 1,000 hours of interviews, 6,000 pages of transcripts. I spent a year coding these. And the big idea that emerged from this is that, as I said earlier, the linear life is dead. The idea that we're going to have one job, one relationship, one spirituality, one sexuality, one political set of beliefs, one source of happiness from adolescence to assisted living, that's dead. That's been replaced by what I call the nonlinear life. And the backbone of this is that we face in our lives, this is what the data from this project show, 36 disruptors in the course of our lives. It could be as small as, twisting your ankle. It could be as big as wrecking your car. It could be new responsibilities at work. It could be being fired. It could be losing a loved one, all over. And most of the one every 12 to 18 months. That's much faster than people think. That's more often than most people see a dentist. But go see your dentist. Most of these we get through, but 1 in 10 of these, or more likely kind of a clumping of them, a pileup as I call it, become bigger. These are the life quakes. Now I use this term life quake because it's higher on the Richter scale of consequences, and they have aftershocks that last for years. And you've alluded to this several times, so let me just slow down and just make the point. It turns out that basically half of these are voluntary and half are involuntary. So 53% are involuntary. So an involuntary life quake is losing your job, losing a loved one, your spouse cheats on you, your house burns down. That's an involuntary life quake. But 47%, that's no small number, are voluntary. You leave your job because you want to start something else. You change religion. You cheat on your spouse, right? And I looked at these numbers. I was born in 1964, and I looked at these numbers and I thought, cool, like 47% are voluntary. Like, we're embracing the opportunity of the nonlinear age. But I had all these millennials, and you have a millennial daughter, unless she's Gen Z. I had these young people in my office, and they were like, whoa, 53% are involuntary. Like, I can't control my life. They were kind of traumatized by this. But here's the thing, like, the life quake can be voluntary or involuntary, but the life transition that grows out of it must be voluntary. Like, you have to choose to lean in. And that's what led me into this space of talking about transitions. And so, yes, to your point, to me, the signature piece of data here is that the average length of the transitions that come out of the life quakes is 5 years. So when you think 3 to 5 in a lifetime, 4, 5, 6 years, that's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives we're spending in transitions. This is basically a lifetime sport that nobody's teaching us how to play, which is in some ways what I tried to write here, which is a rule book for how to play this game, because we're all going through them. You or someone is going through one right now.
So you talk about the stages of a life quake. First one is the long goodbye. What does that mean?
So when you first get into a transition, I would say the life quake doesn't have stages. The transitions do. So you get into a transition.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Yeah.
And people have 1 or 2 reactions. Either they make a 212 item to-do list and they say, I'm going to get through it this weekend and I'm going to be like a champion, or they are like in a fetal position on the bed, like this has never happened to anybody. Neither are really true. And look at enough of them and certain patterns appear. So the first pattern is that there are 3 phases to them. And so the 3 phases are the long goodbye. And in the long goodbye, you have to confront the fact that this is an emotional experience. Like, the top 3 emotions people struggle with are fear. How am I going to live without this person? How am I going to pay my bills? Like, what am I going to do? How can I live without these limbs I've just lost in a car wreck north of Grand Rapids, to name one person? The second biggest emotion is sadness. I miss that person. I miss having a job. I miss the life before the pandemic, right? I miss being able to see my friends. I'm just sad. And the third was surprising to me. It's shame. Like, I'm ashamed I lost my job, or I'm ashamed I have to ask for help, or I'm ashamed that I have a child with a drinking problem. And when someone asks me at the grocery store, how's the family? I can't answer it because I'm ashamed. And by the way, that's not gendered. Men and women feel it the same. So you have these emotions. The second part of the long goodbye is sort of using a ritual to say goodbye to. That's why people, they journal, or they jump out of airplanes, or they burn candles, or they bury things in the backyard.
Or you have one
ritualize.
woman. I didn't mean to interrupt you, except that
Please.
I have to say another remarkable thing is the woman who keeps the stethoscope that she used to listen to her daughter's heart before her daughter died. It brings tears to my eyes just thinking about her story.
Well, it's what's remarkable about that story is that that's what she feels about it. So her name is Peggy Stack. She is actually, she's, I believe, the one of the few remaining full-time religious reporters at a major newspaper. And the reason she is because she lives in Salt Lake City and she covers the Mormon church. And so she marries her former employee at this religion magazine that she runs. They move back to Salt Lake City. They have twin daughters, and one of them is born basically with half a heart. And the doctor says, I need to take this daughter of yours to a different hospital. Pretend you never had her. And Peggy says, for a few hours, I thought, yeah, that's right. I'll just pretend I never had this daughter. The husband went with the other daughter and then came back. And she says, I'm going to pretend. And he's like, no, she's a human being and she's part of our family and she's always going to be. So they head down this incredible, I can't remember exactly, 2-3 years, surgeries, procedures, barely life. They go into incredible debt and they're just struggling to keep her alive. Eventually, she dies. And what she says to me is so interesting. Looking back, it was the best time of our marriage. Because there was this other force. We were allied. Yeah. Now suddenly we're just like everybody else. We've got a young child. We have all this debt. It's not special time. I can, as someone who went through cancer for 2 years, I totally can relate to this. Like your time is, and she said they needed some way to kind of both hold on and let go to the past. Yeah. And the stethoscope began that you can put it on the shelf. You can not have it when you don't want to have it, but you can look over. The psychologist called social snacking. Like there's something about having a memento from a loved one. Yeah. I talked to this guy who was born in the inner city, Philadelphia, had a really tough life, was incarcerated at 19, already had, I think, children from 3 different moms, went through a program, maybe he was arrested for the first time at 19 and maybe incarcerated in his early 20s. He had 3 children. He went through a program for incarcerated dads. He got out. He now runs that program. He tells me he has the boots he was wearing in prison by the back door of his house to remind himself how lucky he was to be alive.
I picked out that story as well. I saw that story struck me as being a remarkable.
And then I talked to Eric Haney, who is, up in the Appalachian Hills of North Georgia, 13th generation cracker, who's in the first generation of Delta Force, who is in the deserts of central Iran in an airplane, in a helicopter that the wings of, he's in an airplane and a helicopter clips it, catches on fire. He's pulled from the airplane and he escapes in what turns out to be the failed Iranian hostage rescue mission. Yeah. He says to me, he has the boots he was wearing on that mission in his office to remind him how lucky he is. Like that's what would happen to me in these stories. So we use mementos, we use rituals. This is all the part of saying goodbye to the world that's not coming behind.
I didn't mean, first of all, I apologize for interrupting the way you
I love telling the stories.
I love that story, those stories, the stethoscope, the boots. But okay, so when people read the book, because I really want to as we get closer, we're not out of time, but before we get too close, we've got the long goodbye, you described the messy middle, and then the new beginning, and your book helps us understand how it helps us identify those stages that follow a life quake, and I think gives us all some hope that what we're experiencing is not unique alone, that we have friends out there who we don't even know, who are going through the same experiences we are. And that's, I think, one of the reasons people need to read this book. Fair enough? Yeah?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that. Just to kind of blitz through for a second. Yes, there's the long goodbye where you say goodbye to the old you. It's hard. Look at the pandemic. We all thought we were going back for the first few months. We now know we're not going back. Yeah. That leads us to the messy middle, which is the process of shedding habits and creating new ones. People use astonishing acts of creativity. They sing, paint, dance. Like what happened when the pandemic came? What was the cliche? What did everybody do when the pandemic came? They started baking, right? We were going to sourdough our way through the pandemic. I may have been the only person in America who was not surprised, because that act of imagining a loaf of bread is the first step to imagining a new life. And then there's this new beginning where you unveil your new life. Everybody's good at parts of this and bad at parts of this. And yes, I try to walk you through it, but I want to address what you said. This book has now been out for a few months. It did become a top 10 New York Times bestseller. I'm blessed and fortunate in that regard. But why did it touch such a nerve? Because of what you just said. The number one reaction to this book is, whew, I'm not alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like I remember, I am blocks, Bill, from where I lived when I had cancer a decade ago. And I remember sitting in the house I was living at the time had like a galley window kind of thing. And there was a window seat, and I would sit on the window seat and I would look out and I would look down at people walking on the street. And I was on crutches, as I said, for 2 years. And I would say, you know how to walk. Like, you don't have cancer. Like, you don't know what it feels like. You're just rolling the stroller to the playground and you don't have this feeling. It was this incredible feeling of isolation, of disconnection, of being alone and sort of angry and upset and just confused. That's, by the way, one reason we're more creative is because we're not restricted. But what we're in now, this collective involuntary lifequake of the pandemic. What I want to say to everybody here is, whether you stay up last night, unable to sleep, whether you got a cup of coffee this morning and stared out of the window, you are struggling with questions that everybody else is struggling with in one way or another. You're not alone.
Well, thank you for going there, because the reason I mentioned time is I don't want to miss the opportunity to talk a bit about the pandemic and how we're all experiencing it. I said to you off air here, I thought it would be interesting to think about the word surus. We all know what surus is. It's misery. It's, I got troubles. And that part of it we get. But the second part of it is we love to share. We're Jews. We love to share our surus. And I think that's fascinating, and it's important to what we're going through now and to what you're saying about we're not alone. But then Leo Rosten says, and I think this is great, there's no singular for surus. It's a plural word, because Jews suffer collectively. We understand, and there's a big part of your book is about collective as opposed to individual life quakes, right? So, okay, let's go a little deeper on that.
Okay, so let me start with the latter point and then go to the surus point. So I mentioned earlier that I was dividing these life quakes, voluntary, involuntary. I said that was more or less 50-50, 53-47. Then I did personal and collective. And that was not equal. Like, most of them were individual. Like, most of the life quakes were things that we were going through by ourselves. In fact, the smallest category, if I remember correctly, was collective involuntary life quakes. And there was what I would say, as a writer, a throwaway line in my book, which is I make this observation in the book. It's like a sentence. I thought, had I done these conversations a century ago? No, I'm sounding like a rabbi. Had I done these conversations a century ago, when we had 2 world wars and depression and civil rights and the women's, there would have been many more collective life quakes. And, like, for example, a collective life quake, I should just slow down a second and say collective life quake is a natural disaster with a whole community, a recession. 9/11 came up a lot. You go through it with other people. In fact, I thought, like, I have done the wrong, like, this collective individual was the wrong metric. Like, I made a mistake. And so I say, like, this is the 21st century and we're all focused on ourselves. Boom. The pandemic is the first collective involuntary life quake in a century. So I think, just to make a couple of observations about that, there's good and bad about it. I think the good is we're having a collective experience, and we are now being reminded that we share this planet, that we are in a networked age. We are in a situation where, if the original line of chaos theory, right, which is the butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and there's a tornado in Texas, well, guess what? A butterfly flaps its wings in Wuhan, and my kids can't go to school in Brooklyn. So it's a reminder that we share this planet together and that we are connected. And it's also a reminder that you're going through a life quake, and she's going through a life quake, and he's going through a life quake, and it makes us a lot more empathetic for the fact that other people are doing. The big market for my book turns out to be people that are going through a life quake. The bigger market is people who are living with someone who are going through it, and they just need something to help. But there's also, I think, a downside to the collectivity, and that is the following, and that is that it looks like we're all going through it together, and we are, but the truth is, back to the thing I said earlier, which was also kind of a secondary point in my book that's become, I'd say, primary now that it's out in the world, which is the life quake can be voluntary or involuntary, but the life transition must be voluntary, because the way you're going to respond to this, you may focus on move, right? There's a thing in my book, 61% of people move. I don't know about you, Bill, 61% of my conversation, someone's talking about moving. Okay. So somebody else may think I want to deepen my relationship. Somebody may say, I want to get more religious or less religious. Somebody may say, I'm trapped with somebody who drinks too much and I need to get out of this bad marriage. So everybody's responding in a different way. So we think we're going through it together, but actually it's a reminder that we're different. But to go back to your thing about Suris, and that's the point of collectivity. And this takes us back, and where I want to go with that question is the thing that you pushed me on so thoughtfully, brilliantly, I would say, to connect this to the earlier parts of my life. Again, I thought this was different from the religion and those parts of my life. But if you look at the great stories of all religions, Abraham leaving his father's house and going on the journey to the promised land, a place he doesn't even know where it is. The Israelites leaving Egypt and going out into the desert. Jesus going for 40 years into the desert. Paul on the road to Damascus. The Buddha going into the forest. And the Hindi, it's the going into the wilderness. It's Muhammad going out. They all have these stories of collective identity being formed in the most difficult times. And then let's go one step further, because this is your wheelhouse, whether it's Odysseus going on the journey, whether it's, Orpheus going into the underworld, whether it's Hercules going, time and again, these stories, the great stories that have survived century after century, millennium after millennium, are stories of when we go into that dark place, confront that wolf, and have to figure out how to become the hero that overcomes the adversity.
I love the way you describe this in the context of great literature, culture. I'll add one for you. Not the Disney work, not Disney, but if you watch the Cocteau, Beauty and the Beast, that incredible French black and white picture about Beauty and the Beast, that's another fairy tale that's about a life quake and the transitions that you go through. I just wanted to add that because I think it's a fascinating example of the kind of thing we all have these stories that we have read and loved or had to study in school over the years. And I love the fact that you talk about them so eloquently.
And so as we end here, I will say, let's go back inside that brain for a second where the story of who you are is living. And we know now that our brains have mirror neurons. And we know that when you tell a story, my brain is processing that ending. And when there's a surprise, I have to pay more attention, and I'm learning how to tell my own story.
Yeah.
And that's fundamentally what this is about. So my message, at the end here for me is that story that's going around in your head, spend more time listening to that story. Spend more time thinking how to cultivate that story. And what I want to say to you is whatever kept you awake last night, or you were drinking coffee and looking out the window and worrying about this morning, I was where you are. And I went out and met all these people who frankly were, many of them, in a lot worse. And it's not just that they gave me hope, which they did. It's that they showed me there are actual things you can do to reclaim your story, to get through this moment, to say goodbye, to surpass, to clean up the messy middle and to unveil your new self. So if you come on this journey with me, you're going to be changed, you're going to be helped, but ultimately you're going to be reminded that whatever wolf you're facing right now, you can get around, over, or through that wolf. We can get through this together.
Bruce Feiler, it's always so inspirational to talk to you. I mean, it's beyond it. I mean, you're inspirational in the way you talk about life in general, but it's also, I mean, if I ever can have a dinner party again, you're guest number one and your wife, Linda, number two, because I really do love the way you look at the world and the way you've written about the world in your books. I'll hold it up again. Life in the transitions, mastering change at any age. What a pleasure to get to talk to you, Bruce. Take care of yourself. Take care. stay healthy, wear a mask, and I wish you nothing but the best. Thank you, Bruce.